Tea at school isn't a new phenomenon, but educators and parents recognise that there has been a significant increase in the prevalence of anxiety among children in the past year as a result of COVID-19, the lockdowns, and measures to ensure the safety of those kids who are back at school or in the process of returning. My next guest says there are steps that parents and teachers can take to ensure that they recognise red flags in kids and then respond appropriately if they're concerned that a child is taking strain emotionally. Dr. Jacques Mostert holds a PhD in psychology of education and is a brand academic manager at Abbotts. A very good morning to you, Dr. Mostert, and thanks so much for joining us. What's the first step then to dealing with anxiety? I suppose recognising that it's there in the first place.
Good morning, Sarah Jane, and good morning to all of your listeners. Yes, indeed. If we can see that anxiety is starting to build up, obviously forming an understanding of what causes anxiety is important, but also just recognizing it and speaking towards it and being open about the sense of anxiety. That I would say is definitely the first step.
I wonder also, particularly when you're dealing with children, I imagine that language is also a consideration, because if you're dealing with teenagers, then they may well be able to sort of come to you and say, Mom, Dad, or teacher, I feel anxious. That I know that what anxiety feels like. I know that word. I know to marry that word to this feeling. But if you're dealing with very, very small children, they may not necessarily have the language to communicate that. So what are some of the signs that we should be looking out for?
Well, interestingly enough, you might imagine that a teenager would say, I'm feeling anxious, but actually they don't. And some of the signs that we look for in young children, as well as in teenagers, is a sudden change in behavior, let's say over a period of about 3 or 4 weeks. So we'll find sometimes that there's a sense of inattention or restlessness, something that just doesn't feel typical of what we used to. In younger children, we find that they become quite clingy. This would be the kid that remains in the car to the very, very last minute before they have to go into school. One of the things that we sometimes say is naughty behavior, but actually it is not. It is a very serious sign of anxiety, is sudden disruptive behavior. You know, a young person that is usually quite good, do their homework, they would be quite positive, suddenly erupting in anger at a teacher, or even swear at a parent, you know. And then we immediately think this child needs to be disciplined, but actually that is a very serious sign that something is not right there. And then what is really, really important is that suddenly they start avoiding their social group, their peers. They tend to isolate themselves.
I wonder if school refusal has also increased. We spoke to a psychologist a few weeks ago on the show about the phenomenon of school refusal and the link between anxiety. And I wonder if that maybe we've seen an increase in that since the start of the pandemic.
Absolutely so. You know, just sometimes we would say that a kid would say, but I'm not feeling well, and they would actually come up with real symptoms. And once you take them to the doctor, there is absolutely nothing to be found. So what we must know about anxiety is that it very much has a bodily, physical impact on how the young person feels. Quite often we see that young people, whether they're very young or even teenagers, go to the school, to the front office and say, I'm not feeling well, please call my mom. They often say that they feel nauseous. They often say that they have a headache. And
they do. We're saying that those are valid things that they may be feeling, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. They're definitely feeling it. They are not faking this. These are actual things that they are feeling because of the way that anxiety works.
I wonder, just to reset, we're talking this morning to Dr. Jacques Mostert, who's a brand academic manager at Abbotts and also has a PhD in psychology of education. We're talking about anxiety in children, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and how that might manifest at school. So if you are a parent who feels that perhaps your child's behaviour has changed and you're wondering if it could be down to anxiety, or if you are a teacher who is experiencing, and I'm sure that you would see a change in your learners and want to get some advice in terms of how to deal with that, but also I guess to create a safe space for children to speak about their concerns.
So one of the things that we see with kids with anxiety is the onset is because of a sense of isolation or the unknown and not being in control of something. And you're very correct there. By creating a space of openness and just being able to talk about our feelings in class. You know, most lessons that are taught don't have to be the lessons that are actually on the lesson plan. More often just opening up to young people and recognizing that we ourselves also have a sense of the not being in control or the unknown, and that sometimes we also feel anxious about things. That creates that sense of, okay, it's fine to acknowledge that I am feeling this.
At what point, Doctor, what point should parents seek the help of a professional? What are some of the signs where perhaps, okay, this might be out of our emotional or our capacity as parents, and it's time to bring in a professional to assist?
So the one thing that I want to make very clear is that there's a difference between having anxiety and generalized difficulties with anxiety and actually having a disorder.
Right.
So the difference between the two is the one kind of, when we're in class, the brain kind of shuts down. They tend to be focusing on one thing only, or they can't pay attention. But a disorder becomes something that actually causes the young person to not function in a way that we would consider to be normal. So, for instance, I've had a case where a young person couldn't walk past a certain classroom and would become violently ill when walking past that classroom. And that obviously then becomes a sign that there's something really wrong. And that is when you start seeking professional help. It's when the young person can no longer function in what we would say be a normal way. School refusal just because I'm feeling a little bit ill, and school refusal where you say, I am not going to school at all, and there's no way through bribery and corruption or any other way that you actually can get that kid to go to school.
Sure, yeah.
That becomes an actual problem, and that's when parents need to go and seek help.
I think the other thing also to think about, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit, is of course children have their own fears, their own concerns and things that they feel anxious about, but very often they pick up things from us as their parents, don't they? So how do we deal with that? I mean, we don't, of course we want to communicate with our kids, but we don't want our fears to become their fears, do we?
You're very correct there. So what often happens is that I'm one of those people that really feel strongly about having dinner together and having no TV on while we're having dinner and having discussions. But as adults, we then tend to kind of vent our own anxious moments during the day, etc. So I think the time that we spend with our young people, with our children, should be a time when we actually show the gratitude that we have for things. I am grateful for today. I listened to one of your previous guests talking about keeping warm, and just the fact that I'm grateful that I can keep warm, for instance. So it's the small things, talking about the things that went well rather than talking about the things that are not going well, getting a sense of positivity when we talk about things. But that's not just great for the young people, that's also good for us.
Sure.
You know, recognizing that there are good things around us. Yes, we have COVID, but I'm also able to stand outside sometimes and just take a deep breath of fresh air without a mask on, and I'm grateful for that.
Doctor, how does one deal with, and this will be the reality for many, many families, how does one deal with things, for example, where perhaps mom, dad, even both have lost their jobs, money is tight, there's now a financial strain on the family and the stress that comes with that. Presumably everything is about things being age appropriately communicated, but do our children need to know the minutiae of those details? Do they need to know mom and dad are struggling and we've got to make the bond payment or the rent payment? How do we have those conversations, and how do we do it, or do we not? And
No, I always believe in being open and honest with young people, because remember, when we want to build resilience, we cannot give the young person only the good news. They need to understand that there's a balance in life.
Got it.
And when we talk about that balance, but we talk in terms of this is the reality, but also the reality is that things always change. So yes, right now things are not the best they have ever been, but they will get better. So I don't think that we should necessarily discuss the smallest parts of the bills with young people. But what we need to do is we need to say that, guess what? We need to save a little bit of money, and that's why we're not switching on the heater right now. We're rather layering up.
Yeah.
Lying to a child can never work, because children have this uncanny ability to just realize when they are being lied to. And when we lie to them, that increases the anxiety, that increases the sense of not being in control or the unknown.
Yeah. All right. So, in practical terms, what can children do? What can we do to help reduce anxiety? I know that a lot of people suggest sort of breathing techniques.
Yes, that breathing technique is absolutely vital. So I call it the 5 in, the hold the 5, 5 out, hold the 5 in, and you do it 5 times. Now, the reason why breathing is so important is, if we understand a little bit about anxiety, it is because there's a chemical in our brain called cortisol, and that releases a sense, actually adrenaline. And adrenaline then makes our heart beat faster, it makes us take deeper breaths, and it actually goes into the stomach, and that's why sometimes kids say that they feel really, really nauseous. Now, when that cortisol doesn't stop being released, that causes a panic attack. So when we breathe deeply, the cortisol stops being released, the adrenaline stops flowing through the body, and we then have that sense of, okay, fine, things are getting better now. So actually, the breathing technique is much better than any form of medication that you can have, unless you have a serious disorder. So that is definitely one. And then I've spoken previously about just being grateful and talking positively about gratitude, because what that does, it releases another thing in the chemical in the brain, which is called dopamine, and dopamine makes us feel better. So the combination of stopping the cortisol release and increasing the dopamine, that actually is the opposite of that panic attack. It stops the panic attack.
What about things like exercise? Because it can be, particularly and we talk about that sort of difficult teenage adolescent period. For some children, some young people, they might just prefer to sort of go and bury their head in a computer game or Netflix or whatever it may be. But I imagine that that's not necessarily a great idea.
No, that is not a very good idea. So when I deal with young people with anxiety and when I do training with teachers and with parents, I say that we need a very good balance between green time and screen time. Now, our young people obviously live in social media. They live in a world that you and I can hardly imagine.
Yeah.
But it is also important that sometimes they just shut the social media off and go outside, whether it is summer, whether it is winter, and just spend a little bit of green time. Now, green time doesn't always have to be outside. Green time can always be just a time that we spend not being on social media, not in front of a screen. And there's a little bit of a technical reason why that is. So screens have this inbuilt blue light which keeps us awake. When I lived in the United Kingdom and the sun would only rise at about 9:30 in the morning, I had a blue light on in my office so that I can feel awake. But our telephones and our mobile devices and computers have that blue light built in. And if that blue light is on all the time, it means that we no longer just go through that normal rhythm of wakefulness and sleepiness. And then, again, if you awake all the time and you don't get enough sleep, now keep in mind that teenagers need between 8 to 9 hours of sleep for their brain to develop and their brains to clean itself. So that, again, contributes to feeling out of control and the unknown and that sense of isolation.
We're going to have to leave it there, but it's some fascinating and some very helpful tips also there to help deal with your child's anxiety if you feel that perhaps things have got to them, and I think it would only be natural that would happen. Lovely to have you with us, Dr. Jacques Mostert. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Great to have you with us.